This is Jake Thornton, broadcasting from emergency radio station KSTM 97.3. If you're hearing this, you're still alive, and that means something in a world that's been turned upside down by nature itself. My voice might be the only human contact you've had in days, and I want you to know that you're not alone in this nightmare. I've been up here in this tower for 17 days now, watching the Pacific Northwest transform into something unrecognizable, something that shouldn't exist on this planet. It's been exactly 17 days, 4 hours, and 23 minutes since the atmospheric river that was supposed to bring us moderate rainfall turned into something meteorologists are calling an unprecedented supercell complex. What started as a typical Pacific storm system, the kind we see every winter, has morphed into a relentless engine of destruction that refuses to move on. The National Weather Service predicted 3 to 5 inches of rain over 48 hours. Instead, we've received over 37 inches in the first week alone, and that was before the real violence began. Let me paint you the picture from up here in the KSTM tower, 47 floors above what used to be downtown Portland. The concrete jungle below is now literally a jungle of debris, twisted metal, and rushing water that looks more like a war zone than the city I've called home for 15 years. The Willamette River has swallowed the Burnside Bridge, the Morrison Bridge, and what's left of the Hawthorne Bridge is just twisted steel beams jutting out of brown, churning water. The storm drains gave up trying to keep up about 2 weeks ago, and now the streets are rivers flowing toward the valley at speeds that would make whitewater rafters nervous. But here's what the Weather Service isn't telling you, and can't tell you anymore since their Doppler stations went dark on day 12. These aren't normal thunderstorms, and I'm not just talking about their intensity. The temperature differential between the upper and lower atmosphere has created what I can only describe as a weather factory that operates 24 hours a day. Cold air masses from the Arctic, some measuring negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit at 30,000 feet, are colliding with superheated moisture from an unusually warm Pacific that's running 8 degrees above normal temperatures. This creates a pressure cooker effect that's spawning supercells every 6 to 8 hours with the reliability of a factory assembly line. The electromagnetic signature of these storms is unlike anything in the meteorological record. Normal thunderstorms generate maybe 10 to 20 lightning strikes per minute during peak intensity. These monsters are producing over 300 strikes per minute, and the electrical discharge isn't following normal patterns. Instead of the typical cloud-to-ground strikes that last microseconds, we're seeing sustained electrical arcs that can last 4 or 5 seconds. Rebecca Torres was on the phone with me this morning from her apartment in the Pearl District, or what's left of it after yesterday's supercell passed through like a freight train loaded with dynamite. She's a structural engineer, someone who understands how buildings are supposed to behave under stress, and the fear in her voice when she described what she was seeing shook me to my core. She said the winds weren't just howling anymore, they were screaming like living things in pain, and the sound was driving people to madness in the shelters. The anemometer on our tower clocked gusts at 127 miles per hour before it was torn away yesterday evening, but Rebecca said the ground level winds felt even stronger. She watched a metro bus, one of those 40-foot articulated buses that weighs about 35,000 pounds when empty, get picked up and thrown like a child's toy across 3 city blocks before it slammed into the side of a 20-story apartment building with enough force to punch completely through the structure and out the other side. Rebecca told me something that's been haunting me for hours. The hail isn't just ice anymore. Mixed in with chunks of ice the size of softballs are pieces of concrete, fragments of building facades, park benches, street signs, even pieces of cars that have been lifted so high into the atmosphere that they freeze solid before being hurled back down at terminal velocity. She found a chunk of what looked like granite embedded in her neighbor's roof, except when she examined it closer, it was actually compressed garbage and debris that had been subjected to such pressure and cold that it had become solid as stone. The updrafts in these storms are so powerful, they're lifting debris thousands of feet into the air, carrying objects weighing hundreds of pounds into the stratosphere before spitting them back down as deadly projectiles. Yesterday, I watched through binoculars as an entire food truck was sucked up into a supercell and disappeared into the rotating mass of clouds. 20 minutes later, pieces of it started raining down over a 6-square-mile area east of the city, some chunks still bearing recognizable logos and paint schemes. The electromagnetic activity is so far off the charts that our instruments can't measure it accurately anymore. Lightning isn't striking randomly like it should be. Instead, it's following patterns, creating what atmospheric physicists call leader channels that are essentially highways for electrical discharge carved into the air itself. These channels can last for hours, creating permanent pathways that multiple lightning bolts follow like cars on a freeway. The result is lightning strikes that don't just flash and disappear, but continue for 3, 4, sometimes 5 seconds of sustained electrical discharge. The heat generated by these sustained lightning strikes is so intense that it's creating effects we've never seen before. Sand on the riverbank is being turned into twisted sculptures of green glass. Asphalt roads are melting and flowing like rivers of tar, carrying cars and debris downstream in slow-motion avalanches of molten pavement. I need to tell you about the Brennan family from southeast Portland, because their story illustrates just how inadequate our normal storm preparedness has become. Tom Brennan called in on day 10, just before the cell towers in his area went down for good, his voice tight with panic, as he described trying to keep his family alive in conditions that would challenge trained survival experts. He'd followed all the emergency protocols, barricaded his family in their basement, stocked up on water and food, even had a battery-powered radio to stay in contact with emergency services. But the storm wasn't content to stay above ground. The pressure differentials created by these supercells are so extreme that they're affecting structures below ground level in ways that engineers never anticipated. Basements are either flooding from water forced through microscopic cracks in foundations by atmospheric pressure, or they're imploding as the pressure above ground drops so rapidly that the air inside becomes relatively dense enough to crush the structure from within. They moved to the bathroom, following the old tornado safety advice about finding the smallest room with the most walls, but Tom told me that the lightning wasn't behaving like anything in the safety manuals. Instead of just hitting metal objects and tall structures, it was following water pipes, electrical conduits, even wet concrete, turning the entire electrical and plumbing infrastructure of the city into a massive lightning rod network. His neighbor's house exploded from the inside out when a lightning bolt followed their plumbing system and superheated the water in their pipes, creating a steam explosion that blew out every window and door in a 2-block radius. The Brennans made it to day 14 before we lost contact. Tom's last transmission was barely audible through the electromagnetic interference, something about moving to higher ground because the basement was filling with water that was somehow flowing uphill. I don't know if they're still alive, and that uncertainty is eating away at me as I sit up here in relative safety, watching the city die block by block. The psychological impact of these storms goes beyond anything we've prepared for. Normal severe weather events have beginnings, peaks, and endings. People can endure almost anything if they know it will eventually stop. But these storms don't stop. They pause, they shift, they merge with other systems, but they never truly end. It's like living inside a permanently active volcano that could erupt at any moment, and the constant stress is breaking people's minds as surely as the winds are breaking their homes. Dr. Patricia Walsh, a psychiatrist who's been broadcasting survival psychology tips on emergency frequency 146.52, describes something she calls atmospheric trauma syndrome. When the environment itself becomes unpredictable and hostile, she explained, the human brain starts to break down the basic assumptions about safety and shelter that we need to function normally. People are developing symptoms that look like post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's not post-traumatic because the trauma never stops. It's ongoing, continuous psychological assault where the source of danger is literally the air around them. I've been getting reports of survivors who refuse to come out of underground shelters even during calm periods, convinced that the sky itself has become their enemy. Others have developed what Dr. Walsh calls hypervigilance syndrome, where they can't sleep or rest because they're constantly listening for the next pressure change, the next rumble of thunder, the next sign that death is falling from above. Some people have stopped speaking entirely, as if words themselves might attract the lightning. The economic implications are staggering in ways that go far beyond property damage. The Port of Portland has been completely destroyed. Not just the buildings and docks, but the actual riverbed has been scoured and reshaped by the pressure waves. Shipping containers weighing 40,000 pounds have been scattered across the landscape like playing cards, some found 15 miles inland from where they started. The agricultural areas of the Willamette Valley, which supply food for much of the Pacific Northwest, are buried under 6 feet of debris and contaminated by runoff from damaged industrial sites. But perhaps most terrifying is how the storms seem to be affecting the geological stability of the region itself. The constant electromagnetic bombardment is heating subsurface rock formations, causing thermal expansion that's creating micro-earthquakes throughout the Cascade Range. Mount Hood's snowpack has completely melted, not from warm weather, but from electromagnetic heating, and the resulting floods have carved new channels through the landscape that look like the work of glaciers moving at high speed. The electromagnetic pulse effects are creating dead zones where no electronic equipment functions at all. These areas move with the storms, expanding and contracting like living things, leaving behind regions where anything more complex than a mechanical wind-up clock simply doesn't work. Cars with electronic ignition systems are becoming permanent lawn ornaments. Hospital equipment fails without warning. Even battery-powered devices are being fried by electromagnetic induction that can generate currents strong enough to melt copper wiring. As I broadcast this, another supercell is forming on the western horizon, and I can see the familiar signs that I've learned to recognize over these 17 days of hell. The clouds aren't just building upward anymore. They're building in spirals, creating massive rotating towers of water vapor that stretch so high they disappear beyond the curvature of the Earth. The electromagnetic buildup is already interfering with my equipment, causing pops and static that sound like rifle shots through the radio speakers. If you're listening to this, if you've survived 17 days of relentless storms that seem designed to erase every trace of human civilization from the Pacific Northwest, then you're part of something unprecedented in human history. We are the witnesses to the birth of a new world and the death of the old one. Hold on to your humanity, hold on to each other, and remember that every hour you survive is a victory against forces that seem determined to prove that nature will always be stronger than anything we can build or imagine. This is Jake Thornton, broadcasting from a world that no longer exists, to survivors of a planet that's still being born. Stay alive, stay strong, and keep listening. Because as long as you can hear my voice, it means we haven't given up yet. Day 23 now, and if you think it can't get worse, you're about to learn just how wrong hope can be. This is Jake Thornton, still broadcasting from the KSTM tower, and I need to tell you something that's been keeping me awake for the past 72 hours straight. The storms aren't just getting stronger, they're getting smarter, and I know how insane that sounds coming from someone who's supposed to understand atmospheric science. But I've been tracking these systems for over 3 weeks now, plotting their movements, timing their formations, and there are patterns emerging that shouldn't exist in natural weather phenomena. The atmospheric scientists who are still in contact, the few whose equipment hasn't been fried by electromagnetic pulses, they're confirming what we're all experiencing, but none of us want to admit. Dr. Victoria Cross from the University of Washington manages to get through once or twice a week when the electromagnetic interference dies down enough for long-range radio transmission, and her voice carries a terror that goes beyond professional concern. She's confirmed that the jet stream has essentially parked itself in a configuration that's creating a permanent storm corridor stretching from northern California to southeast Alaska, a distance of roughly 1,200 miles of continuous atmospheric violence. But here's the part that's been eating away at my sanity since her last transmission 3 days ago. The storms are exhibiting what she called predictive behavior patterns. Each supercell that forms is somehow feeding information, temperature data, pressure readings, moisture content measurements to the next system forming behind it. It's like a conveyor belt of meteorological intelligence, where each storm learns from the destruction patterns of its predecessor and becomes more efficient, more targeted, more devastatingly effective. Yesterday morning, I witnessed something from this tower that I still can't fully process. Something that violates every principle of atmospheric physics I thought I understood. A microburst, which is normally a concentrated downdraft of air that hits the ground and spreads outward like an invisible bomb, struck the Lloyd Center shopping area with such precisely focused force that it didn't just knock down buildings or even destroy them. It compressed them. The mall, a structure designed to withstand magnitude 7.0 earthquakes and hurricane-force winds, was flattened to roughly half its original height in under 30 seconds, as if a giant, invisible hand had simply pressed down on it until the steel and concrete gave up trying to maintain their intended shapes. The pressure wave generated by that microburst was so intense that windows exploded outward for 6 blocks in every direction, not just cracking or shattering, but actually vaporizing into clouds of glass dust that hung in the air like glittering fog. Diana Fletcher, who was sheltering in a reinforced parking garage 3 blocks away from Ground Zero, described it as being inside a giant's fist that was slowly closing. The pressure change was so rapid and so extreme that people throughout the area were experiencing decompression sickness, the same condition that kills deep-sea divers who ascend too quickly from extreme depths. Diana radioed in about 4 hours after the microburst hit, her voice shaky and distorted, not just from the static, but from what sounded like genuine shock. She told me her ears had popped so hard she thought her head would explode, that she could taste blood from her sinuses for hours afterward, and that several people in the garage had passed out from the pressure differential. But that wasn't the worst part, she said. The worst part was the silence that followed. No birds, no insects, no traffic sounds, no air conditioning units or electrical hums, no sound at all except water dripping from broken pipes and the occasional groan of metal settling into new, impossible positions. It was like the storm had sucked the life out of everything in its path, Diana said. And I believe her because I've been watching the same effect from up here. These microbursts aren't just destroying structures. They're creating what I can only call biological dead zones. Areas where nothing living survives. Not because of direct physical damage, but because the pressure changes are so extreme that they're disrupting cellular functions in ways that medical science is only beginning to understand. Dr. Walsh has been reporting cases of survivors found alive but unconscious, their nervous systems apparently scrambled by rapid pressure fluctuations. The ecological devastation we're witnessing goes far beyond anything in the historical record of natural disasters. The old-growth forests on Mount Hood that have stood for over 800 years, trees that survived volcanic eruptions and ice ages, are being stripped completely bare in a matter of hours. Not just the leaves and smaller branches, but the bark, the main limbs, sometimes entire sections of trunk are being scoured away by winds that are carrying debris at velocities approaching 200 miles per hour. What makes this especially terrifying is the composition of that debris. It's not just natural materials like rocks and tree branches anymore. The storms are picking up pieces of destroyed civilization and weaponizing them. Chunks of concrete, fragments of steel beams, entire automobiles, pieces of industrial machinery, all of it gets sucked up into the supercells and then hurled back down with the force of artillery shells. Yesterday, a piece of what looked like a city bus was found embedded 3 feet deep in solid granite bedrock, driven there by winds that turned a 20-ton vehicle into a projectile moving faster than most bullets. Dr. Cross explained during her last transmission that we're witnessing a phenomenon called explosive cyclogenesis on a scale that was previously thought to be meteorologically impossible. Essentially, these are storms that intensify at a rate that breaks every model we have for predicting severe weather behavior. The pressure at the center of these systems is dropping so rapidly that the surrounding atmosphere can't compensate quickly enough, creating a vacuum effect that's literally tearing apart anything that isn't anchored to bedrock with steel cables. The numbers she shared with me are beyond frightening. Normal severe thunderstorms might see pressure drops of 10 to 15 millibars over several hours. These supercells are experiencing pressure drops of over 50 millibars in less than 20 minutes, creating suction forces that can pull the foundation blocks out from under buildings that have stood for decades. It's like the atmosphere itself is trying to escape into space and dragging everything on the surface along with it. Leon Vasquez managed to get a message through from what used to be the Burnside Bridge area before the repeater tower there collapsed under its own weight yesterday evening. Leon's a marine biologist who's been documenting the storm effects on the Willamette River ecosystem, and what he told me during that brief static-filled transmission still makes my blood run cold when I think about the implications for the entire Pacific watershed system. The river isn't flowing anymore, Leon said. The pressure from the storms has created so much turbulence in the water that it's essentially turning in place, creating massive whirlpools and countercurrents that are fighting against the natural downstream flow. He's seen 100-year-old sturgeon, fish that weigh over 300 pounds and have survived everything nature could throw at them for a century, floating belly up with their swim bladders ruptured from the pressure changes. These are fish that can normally adjust to pressure variations of several atmospheres as they move between deep and shallow water. But the atmospheric pressure fluctuations are happening so rapidly that their biological systems can't adapt. We lost contact with the Coast Guard station at Astoria on day 19, and their last transmission before the radio went silent reported something that shouldn't be possible according to everything we know about river dynamics. They were seeing rogue waves in the Columbia River, waves that were breaking backward upstream against the natural current flow. When freshwater and saltwater systems collide under this kind of extreme atmospheric pressure, the results are catastrophic in ways that oceanographers are only beginning to understand. The The infrastructure damage goes beyond anything our emergency management systems were designed to handle. The Interstate 5 corridor, the main transportation artery for the entire West Coast, has been completely severed in 17 different locations between Portland and Seattle. Not just blocked by debris or damaged by flooding, but physically removed, with entire sections of highway simply gone, apparently lifted by the storms, and deposited miles away in twisted fragments that look like modern art sculptures made from concrete and rebar. The electrical grid failed completely 6 days ago, not from storm damage, but from electromagnetic overload that fried every transformer and relay station within a 300-mile radius. Power company engineers who survived the initial failures described electrical surges that exceeded their equipment's capacity by factors of 10 or more, creating power spikes that turned electrical substations into bomb craters and melted copper transmission lines into pools of molten metal. Communication systems are failing in ways that go beyond simple equipment damage. The electromagnetic interference is so intense that it's actually altering the ionosphere, the layer of atmosphere that radio waves bounce off for long-distance transmission. Ham radio operators are reporting that signals are being reflected back to Earth at completely wrong angles, creating echo effects where voices are arriving from directions that don't match where the transmissions originated. But perhaps most disturbing are the reports I'm getting about behavioral changes in the survivors themselves. Dr. Walsh has been documenting cases of what she calls electromagnetic sensitivity syndrome, where prolonged exposure to the intense electrical fields is apparently affecting human nervous systems in measurable ways. People are reporting headaches that coincide exactly with lightning strikes, even when they're in underground shelters and can't see or hear the electrical activity above ground. Some survivors have developed what appears to be the ability to sense incoming storms hours before they arrive, describing feelings of pressure and electrical tension that build in their bodies like early warning systems. Others have reported that their hair stands on end for minutes at a time before lightning strikes, or that metal objects they're carrying become warm to the touch when electromagnetic activity increases in their area. Tomorrow will mark 24 days since this nightmare began, and I'm starting to wonder if we're witnessing the end of human civilization in the Pacific Northwest, or if we're seeing the birth of something entirely new. Something that will require us to completely rethink what it means to be human in a world where the sky itself has become our enemy, and survival depends on learning to read the language of electrical discharge and pressure differentials, like our ancestors once learned to read the tracks of animals in the wilderness. Day 31, and the weight of what I've witnessed is crushing me more than the atmospheric pressure that's been fluctuating wildly for the past week. This is Jake Thornton, and I need to tell you about the Hudson family, because their story represents both the best and worst of what we've become in this new world, where survival depends on understanding forces that seem designed to erase every trace of human presence from the Pacific Northwest. But more than that, their story has shown me patterns in these storms that are making me question everything I thought I understood about natural weather phenomena. The Hudson family, Frank, Janet, and their 17-year-old daughter Olivia, they've become something like legends among the survivors still maintaining radio contact. When I tell you their story, you'll understand why hope and horror have become inseparable companions in the daily struggle to stay alive. But you'll also begin to see the same disturbing patterns that have been keeping me awake for nights on end, staring at weather data that doesn't make sense according to any natural meteorological principles I've ever studied. Day 15, the supercell complex had moved into what meteorologists call autophagy mode, essentially feeding on itself and growing stronger with each rotation like a hurricane that never makes landfall and never dissipates. The Hudson family was trapped in their two-story colonial house in the Laurelhurst neighborhood when the eye wall of one of these monster storms passed directly overhead, bringing with it pressure changes so extreme that Janet later described feeling like her skull was being squeezed in a vice while simultaneously being inflated like a balloon. Now, here's something crucial about these storms that makes them fundamentally different from hurricanes, and it's a difference that saved the Hudson family's lives while teaching us something terrifying about the nature of what we're facing. Hurricane eyes are calm because the rotation is horizontal, spinning around a vertical axis like a wheel rolling across the landscape. But these supercell eyes are vertically oriented, creating a cylinder of relatively calm air surrounded by walls of destruction that rotate around a horizontal axis, like looking up through the center of a massive drill bit that's boring through the atmosphere itself. Frank Hudson, a civil engineer who spent 23 years designing structures to withstand seismic activity, understood something that the rest of us missed in our panic to find shelter and wait for the storms to pass. When the eye passed over their neighborhood, they had approximately 12 minutes of near calm conditions. But instead of using that time to hide deeper in their house or reinforce their shelter, Frank made a decision that seemed insane, but demonstrated an understanding of fluid dynamics that probably saved their lives. He realized that the eye was moving northeast at approximately 40 miles per hour, following the topographical features of the Columbia River Gorge with a precision that seemed almost intentional. If they could match that speed and direction in a vehicle capable of handling the debris-filled roads, they could theoretically stay within the calm zone and ride out the storm from inside its center rather than being trapped beneath its destructive outer walls. It was a plan that required split-second timing, intimate knowledge of local geography, and a vehicle capable of navigating terrain that looked like a battlefield. They loaded into Frank's Ford F-150, a four-wheel drive truck with high clearance that he'd modified for off-road construction site access, and began what would become an 8-hour journey through the calm center of a storm system that was simultaneously destroying everything around them. They could see the walls of the storm on either side, debris spinning in impossible helixes that defied gravity, lightning creating a continuous electrical dome above them that turned the sky into a living ceiling of pure energy that pulsed and writhed like something alive. Janet Hudson's description of that journey still gives me chills when I replay the recording of her transmission from day 16. She said it was like driving through a tunnel made of pure destruction, where they could look to their left and see entire buildings being disassembled piece by piece in perfect detail. Then look to their right and see the same process happening in reverse, as the storm's rotation created debris fields that orbited the eye in patterns that seemed almost choreographed, too organized to be random. But here's where the story becomes remarkable in ways that have implications far beyond one family's survival. They weren't alone in that eye. Other survivors throughout the metropolitan area had figured out the same strategy independently, drawn to the calm zone by instincts they couldn't explain, or by observations that led them to the same impossible conclusion. Dr. Cross later explained that they had inadvertently created the first documented storm convoy, a group of vehicles essentially surfing the calm zone of a supercell, like sailors riding the eye of a hurricane on land. The convoy grew to 17 vehicles before the eye began to dissipate over the Cascade foothills, a collection of survivors that included truck drivers whose rigs were built to handle extreme conditions, families in SUVs and pickup trucks, even a metro bus with 43 passengers whose driver had made the split-second decision to follow the other vehicles rather than seeking traditional shelter. They communicated through CB radio, sharing fuel and supplies during the brief stops when the eye would stall over geographical features, creating temporary safe zones where they could assess damage and plan their next moves. The coordination required for this convoy to survive was unlike anything in the disaster response literature. They had to maintain precise speeds and spacing to stay within the calm zone, navigate around debris fields and destroyed infrastructure, and make real-time decisions about route changes based on topographical features that were affecting the storm's movement. Frank Hudson, with his engineering background, became the convoy's unofficial leader, using his understanding of how structures fail under pressure to predict which roads would still be passable and which bridges would have survived the electromagnetic bombardment. But the psychological cost of this survival strategy is something that none of them were prepared for, and it reveals disturbing truths about what extended exposure to these storms is doing to human consciousness. Olivia Hudson, 17 years old and planning to study environmental science at Oregon State University before the world ended, described watching a horse get caught in the storm wall during their journey through the eye. The rotational forces in these storms are so intense that they don't just kill animals and people, they deform them, stretching and twisting living tissue like clay in the hands of an invisible sculptor. The centrifugal force combined with the extreme pressure differentials creates effects that violate every assumption we have about how biological systems respond to environmental stress. Olivia's description of that horse still haunts me weeks later. She said it stretched like taffy, elongating in impossible ways while remaining somehow alive and aware, its eyes wide with terror as its body was transformed into something that was no longer recognizably equine. The psychological impact on the entire Hudson family illustrates the broader trauma that's affecting every survivor in ways that our mental health systems were never designed to address. Traditional post-traumatic stress disorder assumes that the traumatic event has ended, that recovery involves processing and integrating memories of something that happened in the past. But these storms don't end, they just pause and shift and merge with other systems, creating ongoing trauma where the source of danger is permanent and inescapable. Frank Hudson, despite his engineering expertise and the success of their storm convoy strategy, has developed what Dr. Walsh calls hypervigilance syndrome to such an extreme degree that he can no longer sleep for more than 20 minutes at a time. He's become obsessed with monitoring barometric pressure readings, temperature fluctuations, and electromagnetic field measurements, convinced that he can predict the next storm's behavior if he just gathers enough data. His wife says he talks in his sleep about pressure gradients and wind shear patterns, his subconscious mind still trapped in the mathematical calculations that kept them alive during their 8-hour journey through hell. Janet Hudson has developed a different but equally disturbing response to their survival experience. She's become convinced that they were meant to survive, that their successful navigation of the storm eye was evidence of some kind of divine intervention or cosmic purpose. This might sound like a positive coping mechanism, but Dr. Walsh has identified it as a form of survivor's guilt that manifests as messianic delusions. Janet believes that their survival obligates them to save other people, and she's been taking increasingly dangerous risks to rescue strangers from situations that trained emergency responders wouldn't attempt. The convoy they were part of eventually dissolved when the eye they were following merged with another storm system over the Cascade Range and became too chaotic to track safely. The merging process created electromagnetic phenomena that none of them were prepared for, with lightning strikes that seemed to bounce between the convoy vehicles like pinballs, drawn to the metal frames, but somehow not quite making contact. Several survivors described feeling electricity building up in their bodies, their hair standing on end for minutes at a time, while sparks jumped between their fingers and metal surfaces. But their 8-hour journey through the eye gave us crucial intelligence about storm behavior that's raising questions I don't want to contemplate. The eye didn't move randomly across the landscape. It followed specific geographical features with a precision that suggests either an impossible level of natural organization or something far more disturbing. The storm seemed to avoid certain areas entirely while targeting others with focused intensity, as if it was making deliberate choices about what to destroy and what to preserve. The storm systematically destroyed infrastructure that would be necessary for large-scale evacuation or military response, while leaving intact smaller facilities that would be useful for survivors operating in small groups. Bridges that could handle heavy military equipment were destroyed, while smaller footbridges that could only support individual travelers remained untouched. Communication towers were targeted with electromagnetic bursts, but smaller radio relay stations in remote locations survived intact. The more I analyze the data from their convoy experience, the more convinced I become that these storms are exhibiting targeted behavior that goes beyond anything that natural weather systems should be capable of producing. The pressure changes they experienced didn't follow the chaotic patterns typical of severe weather. Instead, they showed organizational structures that reminded Frank of engineering blueprints, with specific pressure zones designed to channel debris flows in particular directions and create destruction patterns that seemed almost architectural in their precision. The Hudson family's success came from recognizing that fighting the storm was futile, that survival required learning to move with the destruction rather than hiding from it. But this represents a fundamental shift in human consciousness that has implications far beyond emergency preparedness. We're learning to think of ourselves not as masters of our environment, but as small creatures trying to navigate forces that are infinitely larger and more complex than anything our species has previously encountered. The question that haunts me as I watch another supercell forming on the horizon is whether the Hudson family discovered a new form of human adaptation, or whether they simply got lucky during one brief moment when the patterns of destruction happened to align with human intelligence and determination. Because if these storms are truly exhibiting the kind of organized behavior that Frank's engineering analysis suggests, then everything we think we know about natural disasters needs to be reconsidered. And if these storms aren't natural at all, then we're facing something far worse than the end of civilization. We're facing the possibility that someone or something has weaponized the atmosphere itself, turning the sky into an enemy that knows exactly how to destroy everything we've built, while leaving just enough intact to keep us alive long enough to suffer through our own extinction. That's a thought that terrifies me more than any lightning strike or pressure wave, because it suggests that our survival isn't just a matter of endurance and adaptation. It suggests that we're pieces in a game we don't understand, being moved around a board by players whose motivations we can't even begin to comprehend. Day 37, and everything I thought I knew about these storms, everything I've been telling you for over 5 weeks, has just been turned upside down in the most terrifying way imaginable. This is Jake Thornton, and I need to confess something that's been eating away at my conscience since the first lightning bolt struck downtown Portland 37 days ago. I haven't been completely honest with you, and that dishonesty might have cost lives, might have prevented people from understanding the true nature of what we're facing. I'm not just a radio broadcaster who happened to be in the tower when the storms hit. I'm Jake Thornton, former Senior Atmospheric Research Engineer for the Pacific Northwest Weather Modification Consortium, and the technology that's destroying our world is technology that I helped create. That's right, weather modification, the project that officially doesn't exist, the research that's buried under layers of classified documentation and non-disclosure agreements that could send me to federal prison for the rest of my life just for speaking these words into a microphone. For the past 6 years, I've been part of a classified research initiative studying ionospheric heating and atmospheric manipulation techniques that were supposed to revolutionize agriculture, disaster mitigation, and climate management. We called it Project Cloudbreak, a joint venture between the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the Department of Defense, and 3 private meteorological corporations whose names you'd recognize if I could say them without violating national security laws. Our mandate seemed simple, even noble when we started. Develop the capability to enhance precipitation in drought-stricken areas, suppress severe weather systems before they could cause catastrophic damage, and create localized climate modifications that could extend growing seasons and improve crop yields across the American agricultural belt. We were going to save lives, prevent famines, maybe even reverse some of the effects of climate change through precise atmospheric engineering. Instead, we created the technology that's turning the Pacific Northwest into an uninhabitable wasteland where the sky itself has become humanity's enemy. The guilt has been tearing me apart since day one, watching the destruction through these tower windows while knowing that the electromagnetic signatures I was seeing matched the theoretical models we developed for ionospheric heating experiments. The pressure patterns, the sustained lightning formations, the way these storms seem to follow geographical features with impossible precision, all of it corresponded to effects we'd predicted but never tested at this scale or intensity. I kept telling myself it was coincidence, that natural weather systems could somehow replicate the phenomena we'd studied in laboratory conditions. But deep down I knew I was lying to myself and to everyone listening to these broadcasts. 3 days ago, on day 34, I received a coded transmission on emergency frequency 462.75, a frequency that should have been dead for weeks because it required specialized encryption equipment that only Project Cloudbreak personnel were authorized to possess. The signal was weak, barely detectable through the electromagnetic interference, but the encryption signature was unmistakable. It was Dr. Harrison Wells, my former project director, broadcasting from what remained of the Cloudbreak primary research facility in the high desert of eastern Oregon, 137 miles southeast of Portland. Harrison's voice was barely recognizable through the encryption static and the atmospheric distortion, but his words hit me like a physical blow that left me staring at the radio equipment in disbelief. The ionospheric heaters, the massive radio frequency transmitters capable of heating sections of the upper atmosphere to create localized weather disturbances, they hadn't shut down when the storms began. They were still running, operating at power levels that exceeded our most extreme theoretical calculations, pumping electromagnetic energy into the atmosphere 24 hours a day for over 5 weeks straight. The facility logs, Harrison said, showed continuous operation for 37 days, with no maintenance shutdowns, no safety protocols engaged, no automatic power reductions despite atmospheric conditions that should have triggered every emergency system we'd built into the equipment. Someone had been running the ionospheric heating array at 250% of its designed maximum output, creating electromagnetic bombardment that was literally cooking sections of the upper atmosphere and generating the pressure differentials that were spawning these impossible supercell formations. But Harrison's next words made my blood freeze in my veins and confirmed the suspicion that had been growing in my mind for weeks. The authorization codes being used to operate the equipment weren't ours. The command sequences were coming from outside the Project Cloudbreak network, using access protocols that had been modified to bypass every safety system and operational limitation we'd programmed into the system. Someone else had taken control of our research, our equipment, our life's work, and was using it to systematically destroy everything we'd intended to protect. That transmission lasted exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds before the electromagnetic interference overwhelmed the signal and left me alone with the most terrifying knowledge imaginable. The storms weren't a natural disaster that had happened to coincide with our research. They were the result of our research being weaponized by someone with access to classified military technology and the technical expertise to operate ionospheric heating equipment at lethal intensity levels. Someone was using the atmosphere as a weapon, and I had helped them build the gun. The decision to leave the radio tower wasn't just about witnessing the devastation firsthand or bringing you more accurate reports from ground level. It was about reaching the Cloudbreak facility, finding out who had commandeered our equipment, and either shutting down the ionospheric heaters or exposing the people responsible for turning weather modification technology into a weapon of mass destruction. I owed that much to every person who had died in these storms, every family that had been torn apart, every survivor who was struggling to stay alive in a world where the laws of atmospheric physics had been rewritten by human greed and ambition. The journey to eastern Oregon should have been impossible for a civilian traveling alone through terrain that looked like the aftermath of an atomic war. The storm corridors follow predictable patterns now, rotating through the same geographical areas every 18 to 24 hours like clockwork. But getting through them requires precise timing and an understanding of atmospheric pressure dynamics that most people simply don't possess. Fortunately, I had helped design the prediction algorithms that the Project Cloudbreak team used to forecast ionospheric heating effects, and those same algorithms could predict where the artificial storm systems would form and when they would move through specific areas. I left the tower on day 35, using back roads and abandoned logging trails to avoid the major storm corridors that were being continuously bombarded with electromagnetic energy from the heating arrays. The landscape I traveled through was transformed beyond recognition, not just damaged but fundamentally altered at the molecular level by sustained electromagnetic bombardment that had been cooking the soil, the vegetation, even the underlying rock formations for over a month. Trees that had survived forest fires and ice storms were standing like blackened telephone poles, their cellular structures disrupted by electromagnetic radiation that had literally boiled the moisture out of their living tissue. The electromagnetic effects were creating phenomena that belonged in science fiction rather than meteorological reports. Metal objects were spontaneously welding themselves together when electrical current jumped between them, creating bizarre sculptures of fused automobiles and twisted infrastructure that looked like abstract art installations. Areas of intense electromagnetic activity had become what I can only describe as Tesla fields, zones where electricity arced continuously between any conductive materials, creating deadly light shows that never stopped and made travel impossible without specialized protective equipment. Near the town of Bend, roughly halfway to the Cloudbreak facility, I encountered something that confirmed my worst fears about the organized nature of this atmospheric warfare. A convoy of military vehicles, all hardened against electromagnetic pulse effects and equipped with specialized atmospheric monitoring equipment, was moving in formation through a gap between storm cells with the kind of precision timing that indicated advanced knowledge of storm patterns and electromagnetic bombardment schedules. These weren't rescue vehicles responding to a natural disaster. They were moving toward the areas of greatest storm activity, not away from them, following routes that had been planned in advance by people who understood exactly how the artificial weather systems would behave. I followed that convoy from a distance of approximately 2 miles, using the mountainous terrain to mask my approach, while maintaining visual contact through binoculars I'd salvaged from the tower's emergency equipment. What I discovered at their destination was proof that the conspiracy behind these storms went far beyond rogue scientists or foreign saboteurs. This was a coordinated military operation involving American personnel, American equipment, and American authorization codes that had been used to turn our own atmospheric research into a weapon against our own population. The mobile command center they established was bristling with satellite communication equipment, atmospheric monitoring gear, and electromagnetic field generators that I recognized from classified Project Cloudbreak technical specifications. In the center of this technological array, coordinating the operation with the calm efficiency of someone who had been planning this campaign for months or years, was a man I recognized from classified briefings and security photos. Colonel Vincent Cross, United States Air Force, assigned to the Pentagon's Atmospheric Research Division, and brother to Dr. Victoria Cross, the atmospheric scientist who had been providing our supposedly independent scientific analysis of the storm systems. The pieces of the conspiracy started falling into place with sickening clarity as I watched the colonel's team operating equipment that could only have been obtained through official military channels. The storms weren't random events that Dr. Cross had been studying and reporting on. They were coordinated attacks that her brother was directing, using her scientific credibility to provide cover for what amounted to domestic terrorism disguised as natural disaster response. She had been feeding us information designed to keep us predictable and manageable, while her brother used our own atmospheric research to systematically destroy the Pacific Northwest's infrastructure and population centers. I managed to position myself close enough to overhear portions of radio communications between the colonel and what appeared to be multiple other command centers operating throughout the region. The terminology they were using was military tactical language applied to weather systems, discussing storm formations in terms of targets acquired and objectives achieved, referring to population centers as engagement zones and survivor communities as residual resistance that needed to be contained or neutralized through atmospheric pressure. One transmission that I recorded using equipment salvaged from an abandoned emergency services vehicle made the true scope of this operation clear in terms that still make my hands shake when I replay the recording. Colonel Cross was reporting to a superior whose voice I didn't recognize, providing status updates on what he called Phase 2 of Operation Atmospheric Dominance. Phase 1, apparently, had been the initial storm generation that had destroyed most of the region's infrastructure and scattered the population into small, isolated groups. Phase 2 involved systematic targeting of survivor communities and evacuation centers to prevent any organized resistance or large-scale rescue operations. But the most chilling part of that transmission was the colonel's reference to Phase 3, scheduled to begin in 72 hours. He described it as target zone expansion, ensuring that all population centers within a 500-mile radius were either evacuated or contained before beginning what he called continental-scale atmospheric modification. The ionospheric heating arrays weren't just destroying the Pacific Northwest. They were the prototype for a weather modification system that could be deployed against any region of the United States or any country in the world, turning climate itself into the ultimate weapon of conquest and control. The technical specifications that I overheard during their planning sessions matched theoretical models that Project Cloudbreak had developed for worst-case scenario atmospheric manipulation. Research that was supposed to remain theoretical forever because the environmental and humanitarian consequences would be catastrophic beyond imagination. They were discussing ionospheric heating power levels that would create electromagnetic disturbances visible from orbit, storm systems that could maintain themselves for months or years, and pressure differentials that could literally reshape continental weather patterns permanently. I'm broadcasting this revelation from a concealed position approximately 8 miles from the Cloudbreak facility, close enough to see the massive antenna arrays that are pumping electromagnetic energy into the atmosphere at levels that are making my emergency radio equipment malfunction just from proximity to the transmission field. The electromagnetic interference is getting worse by the hour, which means the ionospheric heating intensity is still increasing, still building toward whatever catastrophic climax Colonel Cross has planned for Phase 3 of his atmospheric warfare campaign. Tomorrow, I'm going to attempt to reach the main control facility and either shut down the ionospheric heating systems or document enough evidence to expose this conspiracy to any surviving government authorities who might be able to stop it. The security systems will be temporarily disabled during the daily electromagnetic pulse events that occur when the heating arrays cycle to maximum power, creating windows of opportunity when electronic security measures fail and human guards are forced to rely on mechanical locks and manual procedures. If I succeed in shutting down the heating arrays, the artificial storm systems should begin to dissipate within 24 to 48 hours as the electromagnetic bombardment stops and the atmosphere begins to return to natural pressure and temperature gradients. If I fail, if Colonel Cross and his conspiracy succeed in implementing Phase 3 of their operation, then what's happening to the Pacific Northwest will spread across the entire continental United States, turning weather modification technology into the foundation of a new form of totalitarian control, where governments can literally control whether their populations live or die through manipulation of the atmospheric conditions necessary for human survival. The choice between exposure and action isn't really a choice at all. Too many people have died. Too many families have been destroyed. Too many survivors are struggling to stay alive in conditions that no human being should have to endure. I helped create the technology that made this nightmare possible, and now I have to be the one to stop it. Even if that means sacrificing my life to prevent the complete collapse of civilized society under the weight of weaponized weather systems. If you don't hear from me again, remember that these storms can be stopped, but only if someone with technical knowledge of ionospheric heating systems can reach the control facilities and either shut them down or expose the conspiracy that's operating them. This is Jake Thornton, atmospheric research engineer, former Project Cloudbreak team member, and the man who helped build the machines that are killing you. I'm going to finish what we started, one way or another, because the alternative is watching the entire world become a laboratory for atmospheric warfare experiments conducted by people who view human beings as acceptable casualties in their quest for ultimate environmental control. Day 41, and I'm broadcasting from inside the Cloudbreak facility, the heart of the machine that's been devouring the Pacific Northwest for over 5 weeks. This is Jake Thornton, and what I've discovered here will haunt humanity forever. The truth about these storms, about the conspiracy that created them, it's worse than anything I imagined during those sleepless nights in the radio tower. Getting inside was easier than expected, but not for any good reason. The electromagnetic pulses had fried the electronic security systems, just as I'd predicted. But when I reached the main operations center, I found Dr. Harrison Wells seated at his workstation with a 9mm bullet wound in his head. He'd been dead for less than 6 hours. Someone knew I was coming. The computer logs were intact, protected by hardened servers, and what they revealed made my blood freeze. This wasn't sabotage or foreign infiltration. This was official United States government policy. The operation started 4 years ago with climate projections showing the Pacific Northwest would become uninhabitable within 30 years. Instead of preventing the disaster, a coalition of defense contractors and government officials decided to accelerate it through something called Controlled Catastrophe Protocol. Create an environmental disaster severe enough to force complete evacuation, allowing redistribution of natural resources under military administration. The storms weren't a weapon against foreign enemies. They were a land grab disguised as natural disaster, designed to steal an entire region from its own citizens. The ionospheric heating systems were supposed to operate for 14 days, create evacuation-level storms, then shut down for controlled resettlement. But someone overrode the shutdown protocols. Colonel Vincent Cross had been running the arrays at maximum intensity for over 40 days, turning calculated terrorism into an extermination campaign. His personal logs showed a man who'd become obsessed with controlling weather systems beyond any rational military objective. He'd begun viewing himself as a deity of atmospheric warfare, writing about reshaping continents and establishing civilization where human survival depended entirely on his benevolence. The facility computers showed ionospheric heating stations coming online across the continental United States, synchronized to create artificial storm systems from the Canadian border to the Gulf of Mexico. Storm cells were forming in Texas, Florida, the Great Lakes region, all following the same destruction patterns that had turned Portland into a wasteland. Cross wasn't satisfied with regional control. His files contained correspondence with foreign contractors interested in purchasing weather modification technology. He was planning to sell atmospheric terrorism to any government willing to pay. But I found hope in Dr. Wells's encrypted files. A backdoor he'd built into the control systems, a way to reverse the electromagnetic bombardment and dissipate the storms by inverting the heating patterns. It required manual activation from 3 control stations simultaneously, with authorization codes from both Wells and Cross. Since Wells was dead, I needed Cross's cooperation, or his biometric data. I spent 18 hours preparing for what amounted to a suicide mission to Cross's mobile command center, 12 miles southeast through the most intense electromagnetic activity on the continent. Using a Faraday cage vehicle from the facility's emergency storage, I crossed terrain that no longer resembled Earth. Lightning strikes had turned sand into glass sculptures, metal objects welded together by electrical current into impossible geometric patterns. The electromagnetic fields affected my nervous system even through protective equipment, causing muscle spasms and burning sensations like being slowly cooked by invisible microwave energy. Cross's command center wasn't temporary, but a permanent military base with satellite arrays and electromagnetic generators designed for long-term deployment. This was fully operational weather modification infrastructure built for extended campaigns against civilian populations. Colonel Cross was there, but 4 years of electromagnetic exposure had changed him into something barely recognizable as human. He greeted me by name, confirming my infiltration had been monitored. Instead of treating me as a threat, he spoke like a colleague finally arrived to appreciate his atmospheric engineering project. He wanted to show me real-time data from heating stations across the country, satellite imagery of storms forming in geometric patterns, computer models predicting his weather modification network could reshape global climate within months. Cross believed he was saving humanity by destroying technological civilization, causing global warming. The storms weren't weapons, but environmental restoration tools forcing humans to live in harmony with natural systems he controlled. He offered me a position in his new world order, a chance to expand the ionospheric heating network to every continent. When I refused and demanded shutdown, he explained the system had automatic escalation protocols. Any forced shutdown would increase electromagnetic bombardment by 300%, turning the Pacific Northwest into a permanent dead zone where no life could survive. But Cross had underestimated someone who helped design these systems. While he explained his vision of electromagnetic dominance, I studied his monitor displays, looking for vulnerabilities Wells and I had built in as safeguards. The quantum encryption wasn't as secure as Cross believed. Wells had included a backdoor accepting genetic samples from close family members if the primary user was deceased. Cross had mentioned his sister Victoria during his monologue, and I remembered from personnel files they were twins, sharing enough genetic similarity that her biometric data might unlock the system. I faced the most morally complex decision of my career. Dr. Victoria Cross was innocent, unaware her scientific credibility provided cover for terrorism, but she was the only person whose biometric data could unlock the reversal sequence. I had to choose between protecting one innocent person and saving millions of lives. The choice wasn't really a choice. I contacted Dr. Cross using emergency equipment, told her there was critical malfunction requiring her assistance to prevent catastrophic escalation. She arrived within 6 hours by helicopter through electromagnetic fields that should have made flight impossible, using flight paths her brother had programmed. When she saw the true scope of the weather modification program, when she understood her reports were based on false data hiding the artificial nature of storms, when she realized her brother had used her credibility to legitimize mass murder, the shock nearly broke her completely. But Dr. Cross was stronger than betrayal. When I explained the biometric unlock sequence, she didn't hesitate to provide genetic samples and authorization codes necessary for shutdown. The reversal sequence took 47 minutes, requiring simultaneous inputs from all 3 control stations. Dr. Cross and I operated primary facility controls, while her brother was forced at gunpoint to provide biometric authorization. The quantum encryption accepted our combined credentials, and the ionospheric heating arrays began inverting their output to create atmospheric cooling instead of heating. Colonel Cross fought every step, convinced we were destroying humanity's hope for surviving climate change through electromagnetic weather control. But when arrays switched to cooling mode and the first artificial storm showed dissipation signs, when electromagnetic bombardment decreased and atmospheric pressure stabilized, even he couldn't deny the nightmare was ending. The reversal process will take 18 to 24 hours to complete, but artificial storms are already losing intensity as electromagnetic patterns sustaining them are disrupted. The supercell complexes that terrorized the Pacific Northwest for over 5 weeks are collapsing under chaotic dynamics, and natural weather patterns are reasserting themselves. If you're hearing this final broadcast, the weaponized storms are ending, the conspiracy has been exposed and stopped, and survivors can begin rebuilding. The electromagnetic interference disrupting communications is fading, pressure differentials creating impossible supercells are stabilizing, and the sky is no longer humanity's enemy. This is Jake Thornton, atmospheric research engineer, former Project Cloudbreak team member, and the man who helped build the machines that nearly destroyed the Pacific Northwest. I finished what we started, stopped the technology from spreading across the continental United States, and ensured weather modification will never again be weaponized against innocent people. Remember this story, remember the people who died, and remember that the greatest threats to civilization often come not from natural disasters or foreign enemies, but from people we trust with power to protect us. The sky belongs to everyone, and no one has the right to turn it into a weapon. The storms are ending, the healing can begin. The truth will ensure this nightmare never happens again.